The rusted iron stove was a dead weight, a monstrous, cold heart of a thing that fought them with every foot of ground they gained. Maeve dug her worn boot heels into the loose scree of the incline, her breath pluming in the sharp autumn air, a twin cloud to the one puffing from her sister's lips. Wren, positioned lower down the slope, had her shoulder jammed against the stove's pitted flank, her face a mask of grim determination. Below them, the small, dusty town of Providence was a collection of wooden blocks and smoke signals, its people tiny figures who occasionally stopped their business to stare up at the two girls on the barren hillside. They were a spectacle. Two 17-year-old sisters, thin as reeds but wiry with a strength born of necessity, wrestling a derelict wood stove toward the granite teeth of the high country. Down in the main street, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of pity and derision that carried all the way up the hill on the wind. He had sold them the useless thing for 2 bits, a price that was more of a joke than a transaction. He told them it was cracked, that it would never hold a fire. "It's scrap," he had said, a smirk playing on his lips. Good for nothing but weighing down a corpse. Wren had simply handed him the coins, her gaze flat and unreadable, while Maeve had already been outside, assessing the best way to move the heavy burden. Now, their muscles screamed in protest, the raw hemp of the ropes biting into their palms. This was the last major piece. The final, most difficult part of a plan that had been their entire world for the past 6 weeks. They did not speak. They had not needed to for hours. A slight shift of Maeve's weight, a grunt from Wren, a shared glance, this was their language, a silent, seamless understanding that had been forged in the crucible of a shared existence, from the orphanage cradle to this desperate, windswept slope. The town saw 2 stubborn fools. They saw girls who were too proud, too strange to accept the meager, separated fates offered to them. What they did not see was the cold, clear logic that drove every aching step. Winter was coming. Not the gentle, frosting on the windows kind of winter, but the high country kind, a killer that stalked the mountains and descended upon the valley with teeth of ice and a breath that could freeze a man's heart in his chest. Providence would shutter its windows, stoke its fires, and forget. It would forget the 2 girls it had cast out until the spring thaw revealed whatever was left of them. But Maeve and Wren did not intend to be forgotten, and they certainly did not intend to be found. They intended to survive. With a final, synchronized heave that tore a raw groan from both their throats, they crested the ridge and rolled the stove onto a small, flat ledge, hidden from the prying eyes of the town below. They collapsed against it, chests heaving, the metallic tang of cold iron a strange comfort against their backs. They had done it. The heart was in place. The memory of Matron Gable's office was as cold and spare as the room itself. It smelled of stale soap and disappointment. Just 6 weeks ago, they had stood on the worn floorboards, their hands clasped behind their backs, while the matron looked at them from over the top of her spectacles. She was a woman built of sharp angles and rigid principles, her charity a transaction that required a constant payment of gratitude and subservience. Maeve and Wren, with their quiet self-possession and unnerving twinness, had always been a deficit on her ledger. "You are 17, Matron Gable had stated, her voice as dry as dust. "You are women now, no longer children for the church to support. It is time you made your own way. It is time you became useful." She had laid out their futures like 2 mismatched pieces of cutlery on her barren desk. A position for Maeve as a laundress at the saloon, a place known for its rough clientele and the weary, faded look of the women who worked there. For Wren, a role as a scullery maid for a family on a remote ranch 50 miles to the east, a place of profound isolation. The key was that they would be separated. It was a deliberate, calculated sundering. The matron had always been unnerved by their bond, by the way they moved and thought as one, a silent unit she could not penetrate or control. "These are generous placements," she'd insisted, though her eyes held no generosity. "You will have a roof over your heads. You will be fed." Maeve had spoken first, her voice low but clear. "We will not be separated." Wren had nodded, a single, sharp motion. "Where she goes, I goes." Matron Gable's thin lips had tightened into a bloodless line. She saw not loyalty, but defiance. She saw not a bond of survival, but an act of insolence. "Pride is a sin, girls. And it is a luxury the likes of you cannot afford. The world does not bend for orphans. She stood, the scraping of her chair a sound of finality. If you refuse these opportunities, then I have nothing more for you. The orphanage has sheltered you long enough. My duty is to the younger ones now. You have until sundown to gather your things. The door will be locked. There was no argument, no plea. They had seen it coming. They had felt the shift in the matron's tolerance for weeks, her patience worn thin by their refusal to be anything other than what they were, a unit, a fortress of two. They packed their few belongings into a single canvas sack, a spare dress each, a mending kit, the worn book of poems their mother had left them, and the small, smooth stone each of them had kept since they were children. They walked out of the only home they had ever known as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, leaving the scent of soap and the matron's cold certainty behind them. They did not look back. Their gaze was already fixed on the dark silhouette of the mountains, the one place that offered nothing but also asked for nothing in return. The cave was a secret the mountain had kept well. They found it by accident during a late summer foraging trip, a week after their expulsion from the orphanage. They had been following a stream, looking for late-season berries, when Wren had slipped on a moss-slicked rock. She had fallen against a curtain of thick vines that clung to a sheer rock face. Behind the rustling leaves was a dark opening, a narrow fissure no wider than a man's shoulders. Cool, damp air, smelling of stone and deep earth, breathed out from it. Curiosity overriding caution, they had pushed their way through. The entrance tunnel was short, opening into a surprisingly large, dry chamber. It was not vast, but it was high enough to stand in comfortably, and deep enough to feel like a genuine sanctuary. A thin crack in the ceiling, almost invisible from the floor, acted as a natural flue, creating a faint but steady draft. It was perfect. It was a hidden womb in the heart of the granite, a place the world could forget. Their work began the next day. The first task was to make it their own. They spent days clearing the floor of loose rock and debris, their hands raw and aching, using flat stones as makeshift shovels. They smoothed the earthen floor, tamping it down until it was hard and even. The stove had been their greatest challenge and their greatest triumph. After hauling it up the treacherous slope, they had spent a week meticulously fitting it into place beneath the natural flue. They used a mixture of clay and mud from the streambed to seal the stovepipe to the rock, a painstaking process of application and drying, repeated until the seal was airtight. Wren, with her smaller hands, was better at the fine work, packing the clay into the smallest crevices. Maeve, with her steady strength, handled the heavier lifting, positioning the stove and pipe just so. The cave slowly transformed from a raw, geological feature into a deliberate, functional space. They built low, wide shelves into one wall, wedging flat pieces of slate between natural protrusions in the rock. This would be their larder. On the opposite side, they constructed sleeping platforms, raised off the cold ground, using scavenged planks from a collapsed prospector's shack they had found deeper in the woods. They insulated these beds with thick layers of dried moss and pine boughs, creating fragrant, springy mattresses. They worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by a grim, shared purpose. Every stone they moved, every shelf they built, was an act of defiance. It was a silent testament against Matron Gable's decree that they were useless, a tangible rebuttal to the town's pitying glances. They were not waiting for the world to provide for them. They were carving out their own world, stone by stone, in the cold, silent heart of the mountain. The interior of the cave was a study in order and practicality, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed landscape outside. It was a space built not for comfort, but for survival. And as the days grew shorter and the wind carried the first real bite of winter, it began to feel like the only safe place on Earth. The stockpiling was a relentless, consuming obsession. Every day was a calculation of effort versus reward, of energy expended against calories gained. Their meager savings, a handful of coins saved over years from odd jobs, were spent with surgical precision. They walked the 10 miles to and from Providence only when absolutely necessary, their faces shadowed by hoods, their interactions brief and transactional. At Henderson's general store, they bought the essentials, 100-pound sacks of flour, pinto beans, and cornmeal. They bought salt in heavy blocks, sugar, and a large tin of lard. Mr. Henderson would weigh their goods, his expression a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect for their coin, which was always real. Planning on feeding an army, girls, he'd asked once, a dry chuckle in his throat. Maeve had met his gaze without blinking. Just ourselves. The brevity of her response had ended his questions. They scavenged what they could not buy. They learned the rhythms of the forest, the secret larders of the squirrels, the places where the wild onions grew thickest. They spent weeks gathering firewood, cutting and splitting fallen timber with a salvaged axe head they'd fitted with a new handle. They stacked the wood in a dry alcove near the cave entrance, a fortress of fuel that grew larger with each passing day. The woodpile became a measure of their security, a visible representation of the warmth and cooked meals that would see them through the deep freeze. They did small, anonymous jobs for the few people on the outskirts of town who were either too isolated or too indifferent to care about the town's opinion. They mended fences for a reclusive farmer, receiving a sack of potatoes and a dozen jars of pickled beets in return. They chopped a winter's worth of firewood for an elderly widow, who paid them with 2 thick wool blankets and a small bag of coffee beans, a luxury that felt impossibly decadent. Their most valuable resource, however, came from the river. As the autumn salmon run began, they spent days on the cold, misty banks, using a simple weir and net they had constructed from vines and branches. They caught dozens of fish, their silver bodies flashing in the dim light. They worked late into the nights by the light of a small fire, cleaning and filleting their catch. They salted and smoked the fish over a slow, pungent fire of alderwood, turning the flesh into tough, protein-rich jerky that would last for months. The cave began to fill. The shelves groaned under the weight of their provisions. Sacks of grain were stacked against the far wall. Strings of dried mushrooms and herbs hung from the ceiling. The smoked salmon was wrapped in cloth and stored in a wooden crate. Tins of lard and coffee sat next to jars of rendered animal fat they would use for their simple lamps. It was a treasure hoard of survival, a testament to their tireless labor. The scent of the cave changed from damp stone to the rich, lead aroma of smoked meat, dried herbs, and pine. It smelled of security. It smelled of a future they were building for themselves, one carefully prepared meal at a time. The town saw only 2 feral girls, hoarding scraps like pack rats. They did not see the meticulous planning, the sheer force of will that was turning a cold, empty cave into a bastion against the coming white death. The first frost coated the valley in a brittle, silver glaze, and the town of Providence began to turn inward. Doors were shut a little more firmly, smoke from the chimneys rose a little thicker, and the gazes of the townspeople grew a little more suspicious of outsiders. That included Maeve and Wren. They were seen now and then, flitting at the edge of town like ghosts, their faces thin and weathered, their clothes practical but patched. One afternoon, as they were leaving the general store with a heavy sack of beans between them, Sheriff Brody stopped them. He was not an unkind man, but he was a man who valued order and predictability, and the sisters were neither. "Girls," he said, his voice a low rumble. He tilted his hat back, his eyes assessing them. "Folks are talking. They say you're living up in the hills like savages. Winter's coming on. It's no place to be." Maeve shifted her grip on the sack. "We have a place, the shack?" "Alinta," the sheriff pressed. "A place isn't enough when the snow is 10 feet deep. The church has a fund." "Matron Gable would have to take you back in if I insisted." Wren, who rarely spoke to strangers, answered him, her voice quiet but hard as flint. "We will not go back." The finality in her tone seemed to startle him. Before he could respond, a sharp, nasal voice cut through the air. "Let them be, Sheriff. Pride will be their final meals." Matron Gable was marching down the boardwalk, her face a thundercloud of righteous disapproval. She stopped a few feet away, clutching her shawl tightly around her bony shoulders. They made their choice. They chose the wilderness over a warm bed and honest work. Let the wilderness teach them the lesson they refused to learn from me. She looked them up and down, her gaze lingering on their worn clothes and the determined set of their jaws. It was a look of vindication, the look of someone who believes they have been proven right. Maeve and Wren said nothing. They simply stood there, enduring the woman's scorn as they had endured everything else, with a stony, impenetrable silence. They hoisted their sack and turned to leave, their backs straight, their departure an act of dismissal more powerful than any words. As they reached the edge of town, a different figure appeared. Old Man Hemlock, a trapper who lived so far up in the woods that he was more myth than man, was leaning against the blacksmith's wall. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his clothes made of buckskin. He rarely came to town and spoke to no one when he did. He watched them approach, his pale blue eyes surprisingly sharp. As they passed, he pushed himself off the wall and held out a heavy, rolled bundle. It was a stack of prime, cured beaver and rabbit pelts, soft and thick. He didn't speak a word. He just held them out. Hesitantly, Maeve reached out and took the bundle. It was warm from his body. She looked at him, her lips parting to ask why, but he just gave a single, slow nod. The nod was everything. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. It was a silent blessing from one survivor to another. He turned and shuffled away, disappearing around a corner as quietly as he had appeared, leaving them with a gift of warmth more valuable than gold. The transition was subtle at first. The vibrant gold and crimson of the aspen leaves faded to a brittle brown, and the wind began to carry a different sound, a low, mournful howl that promised cold. The sky, which had been a brilliant, hard blue for weeks, turned to a soft, bruised gray, the clouds hanging low and heavy over the mountain peaks. The first snowflakes were a surprise, fat, wet flakes that drifted down lazily, melting the moment they touched the ground. In Providence, the sight was met with a sense of cozy anticipation. Fires were lit in hearths, storm windows were latched, and the general mood was one of hunkering down, of preparing for a long, communal hibernation. The townsfolk felt secure within their wooden walls, their larders full enough for a normal winter, their community a bulwark against the elements. For Maeve and Wren, the first snow was not a gentle beginning but a final warning. It spurred them into a last flurry of activity. They spent 2 full days making final checks on their sanctuary. They walked the perimeter of the cave, packing any remaining cracks or fissures with a mixture of moss and clay to block the slightest draft. They hauled the last of their cut firewood inside, stacking it neatly against one wall, a dense, fragrant bulwark that reached the ceiling. They took inventory of their supplies, arranging and rearranging the sacks and jars, their movements economical and precise. Every item had its place. Flour, beans, and cornmeal were in the driest corner. Smoked fish and cured meats were hung high. Their precious supply of salt and sugar was sealed in tins. The thick, warm pelts from Old Man Hemlock were laid over their sleeping platforms, a luxurious final touch. Their last trip outside the cave was to the stream. The water was now painfully cold, and a thin sheet of ice was already forming along the banks. They filled every container they had, 2 large wooden buckets and several clay jugs, hauling the heavy loads back to their shelter. This would be their water supply until the spring thaw. As the snow began to fall more heavily, they stood for a moment at the entrance. The curtain of vines that had once hidden the opening was now bare, its leaves gone, but the accumulating snow was quickly taking its place. The waterfall beside their entrance, once a steady roar, had slowed to a thick, syrupy trickle, its edges freezing into fantastical shapes. Soon, it would be a solid wall of ice, a door of crystal that would seal them in completely. They retreated into the darkness of the cave, pulling a heavy, hide-covered wooden frame they had constructed over the entrance from the inside. They sealed its edges with more clay. The sounds of the outside world, the wind, the falling snow, were instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, ghostly whisper. Maeve lit one of their simple lard oil lamps. The small flame flickered to life, casting a warm, dancing glow over their small, ordered world. The air was still and cool, but not cold. It smelled of earth, smoke, and security. They were entombed, but they were not trapped. They were safe. The blizzard did not arrive. It descended. It was not a storm, it was a siege. The gentle snowfall of the previous day was a deceptive prelude. In the middle of the night, the wind rose from a mournful howl to a shrieking, physical force that slammed against the mountain. It tore at the trees, its voice a constant, high-pitched scream of rage. The snow changed from flakes to a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice particles that scoured the landscape. Inside the cave, the world was reduced to sound and sensation. The fury outside was a muffled, terrifying roar, a constant, low-frequency vibration that hummed through the solid rock around them. It felt as if they were in the belly of a great, angry beast. But within their sanctuary, there was an almost surreal calm. The small flame of their lamp burned with a steady, unwavering light. The cast-iron stove, their great prize, glowed with a deep, cherry-red warmth, its cracked side emitting a satisfying ticking sound as the metal expanded. Maeve had filled it with slow-burning hardwood, and it radiated a powerful, life-sustaining heat that pushed back the deep, permeating cold of the stone. They had their first real meal since sealing themselves in. Wren mixed flour, water, and salt to make a simple flatbread, which she cooked on the hot surface of the stove. Maeve heated a pot of beans, thick with a piece of salted meat. They ate in comfortable silence, sitting on their fur-lined sleeping platforms. The food was simple, but it was hot and filling, a profound comfort against the chaos raging just feet away. The contrast was absolute. Outside was a world being torn apart, a maelstrom of white noise and lethal cold. Inside was warmth, order, and the quiet companionship of two sisters who had built their own salvation. They did not need to speak of their victory. They could feel it in the warmth on their skin, taste it in the food they ate, and see it in the calm, steady gaze of the other. For days, they lived in a timeless rhythm dictated by the needs of survival. They slept, ate, tended the fire, and checked their supplies. Maeve would read aloud from their mother's book of poems, her voice a quiet counterpoint to the storm's distant roar. Wren would mend their clothes, her stitches small and neat, a tiny act of order against the universe's entropy. They were utterly isolated, a pinprick of warmth and life buried deep within a world of frozen death. They had no way of knowing how long the storm would last, or what was happening to the town of Providence below. They could only trust in their preparations, in the strength of the mountain, and in each other. They had gambled everything on their own foresight, and for now, deep within the heart of the storm, they were winning. For 3 days, the blizzard was relentless. On the 4th day, the wind died down, but the snow continued to fall, thick and silent and heavy, burying the world in a shroud of impossible white. In Providence, the cozy sense of winter preparedness had evaporated, replaced by a creeping, gnawing fear. This was no ordinary storm. The snow drifts were piled up to the eaves of the houses. The main street had vanished completely. Doors were blocked, windows were plastered over, and the town was suffocating. The first crisis was fuel. The townsfolk had laid in supplies for a typical winter, but no one had anticipated a storm of this magnitude and duration. Woodpiles, once thought to be plentiful, dwindled with alarming speed. The cold was a physical entity, seeping through the walls of the wooden buildings, and the fires had to be kept burning high day and night just to keep the frost from crawling across the floors. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with worry, organized a small group of men to try and clear a path to the wood mill at the edge of town, but the effort was futile. The snow was like an ocean, deep and soft and treacherous. They would dig for an hour only to have the path drift over again in minutes. Panic began to set in. Food was the next concern. While most families were well stocked, the orphanage was not. Matron Gable, in her rigid efficiency, had budgeted for a predictable winter with no room for unforeseen catastrophe. Her larder was nearly empty, and her woodpile was gone. The children, pale and shivering, were huddled together under thin blankets in the main room, their hungry eyes fixed on the cold, empty hearth. The matron's pride and certainty had crumbled, leaving behind a brittle, terrified woman who saw her own short-sightedness reflected in the hungry faces of her charges. The whole town was an island, cut off from the world, and its own resources were failing. The communal spirit frayed. Neighbors eyed each other's woodpiles with suspicion. The cheerful greetings of a week ago were replaced with grim, fearful nods. Mr. Henderson's store was closed, his stock inaccessible behind a 15-foot drift. The town doctor couldn't reach the sick. Providence was not a community anymore, it was a collection of cold, isolated traps, each one slowly running out of time. Sheriff Brody felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. He had seen hard winters, but this was something else. This was an extinction-level event. As he stared out a small, cleared patch of his window at the endless, undulating sea of white, his thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the two strange sisters he had warned just weeks ago. The ones who were living like savages in the hills. He had pitied them then. Now, with a cold knot of dread in his stomach, he wondered if they had been the only sane ones all along. The sky cleared on the fifth day, revealing a world transformed and brutalized. The sun was a pale, distant wafer in a bleached white sky, its light glinting off a landscape of terrifying beauty. The wind was gone, but the cold was deeper now, a profound, still cold that felt as if it could crack bone. The snow had stopped, but the drifts in some places were 20 feet high. Providence was entombed. A desperate meeting was held in the sheriff's office, the only building they'd managed to connect with a crude tunnel. The faces were grim. Matron Gable was there, her features pinched and grey. "We have no more wood," she stated, her voice trembling. "And the food will be gone by tomorrow." Her confession hung in the frigid air. The town was dying. It was then that Sheriff Brody made a decision. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort, a fool's errand. "The girls," he said, his voice hoarse. "The twins. They were stockpiling wood all autumn. Up in the high country." A few men scoffed. "They're dead, Sheriff." "No one could survive this out in the open." "They weren't in the open," Brody insisted, remembering the determined look in their eyes. "They said they had a place. It was enough." A small, exhausted party was assembled, the sheriff, a brawny blacksmith named Arthur, and 2 other townsmen. They set out on crude snowshoes, a rescue mission born of utter desperation. The going was torturous. They sank to their waists in the powder, every step a monumental effort. The cold was a constant, vicious enemy. Hours passed. They were nearing the high slopes, exhausted and on the verge of turning back, when they saw it. Or rather, what they didn't see. The smoke. For days, even through the storm, a thin, persistent plume of smoke had risen from the town's chimneys. Now, looking back, they could see only 1 or 2 pathetic wisps. The fires were going out. Inside their cave, Maeve and Wren had noticed the same thing. Peering through a small, carefully cleared peephole, they could see the valley below. The lack of smoke was an ominous sign. They had a brief, silent conversation with their eyes. Their shelter was secure. Their supplies were plentiful. They could easily wait out the winter, safe and warm. But the sight of that dying town, the town that had cast them out, stirred something in them. It was not pity, but a sense of shared humanity, a connection they couldn't ignore. They made their decision. Maeve put on her warmest clothes and took the shovel. Wren prepared a bundle of smoked fish and a skin of fresh water. They unsealed the inner door of their cave and began to dig their way out through the drift that had buried their entrance. The snow was light and powdery, and after an hour of hard work, a sliver of pale daylight broke through. Maeve pushed open the hide-covered frame and stepped out into the blinding white world. She looked down the slope and saw them, 4 dark figures, struggling, floundering in the deep snow. They were close, near the massive wall of ice that had once been the waterfall. They were about to give up. The 4 men from Providence saw the movement first. A flicker of motion against the vast, static white of the mountainside. They stopped, leaning on their shovels, their breath ragged in the thin, frozen air. They squinted, their eyes watering from the glare. The motion became a figure. A person, standing impossibly on the surface of a 20-foot snowdrift that covered a sheer rock face. It was one of the sisters. She was dressed in practical, warm-looking clothes, a shovel in her hand, her face calm. A moment later, a second figure emerged from the same spot, as if stepping out of the solid mountain itself. The men stared in disbelief. It was as if they were witnessing a miracle or a hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion. Sheriff Brody was the first to find his voice, shouting, his words swallowed by the immense silence. "Hello! Over here!" Maeve raised a hand in acknowledgement. She and Wren began to move down the slope towards them, their steps sure and practiced, using the packed snow to their advantage. When they reached the floundering men, they stopped. The contrast was stark. The men were frost-rimmed, their faces haggard, their bodies trembling with cold and fatigue. The sisters were alert and healthy, their cheeks flushed from warmth, not cold. They looked like creatures from another world, a world of foresight and preparedness. "You're alive," Brody breathed, his voice a mixture of awe and profound relief. "We have a place," Maeve said simply, echoing her words from weeks before. She gestured back up the slope. "There is warmth." And food. She turned and began to lead the way, Ren falling into step beside her. The men followed, stumbling, their minds struggling to process what was happening. The sisters led them to the hole in the snowdrift. One by one, they crawled through the short tunnel and into the cave. The shock was palpable. The sudden, enveloping warmth. The soft, steady glow of the lard oil lamps. The sight of the neatly stacked firewood, the shelves laden with food, the glowing heart of the stove. It was a haven, a pocket of impossible civilization in the midst of a frozen apocalypse. The blacksmith, Arthur, a man of few words, simply stared at the massive woodpile, his mouth agape. He ran a hand over his face, his expression one of utter humility. Sheriff Brody looked from the supplies to the two young women who had gathered them. He saw not the strange, feral girls the town had dismissed, but two architects of survival whose quiet wisdom had shamed them all. He finally met Maeve's gaze. "We were wrong," he said, the words heavy with the weight of the town's failure. "We need your help." Ren, who was already ladling hot broth from a pot on the stove into bowls, looked over at him. "We know," she said, her voice not filled with triumph, but with simple, undeniable fact. The cave became the heart of Providence. The sisters orchestrated the survival of the town with the same quiet, methodical efficiency they had applied to their own. There was no gloating, no "I told you so." There was only practical, life-sustaining work to be done. The first order of business was to bring the children from the orphanage. Sheriff Brody and Arthur, fortified by hot food and a renewed sense of hope, made the perilous journey back to the town, following the sisters' instructions on navigating the treacherous drifts. They returned hours later, leading a huddled, shivering line of children and a humbled, weeping matron Gable. When the matron entered the cave, her eyes fell upon the two girls she had cast out. She saw them not as defiant orphans, but as the saviors of her charges. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, but no words came. Maeve simply handed her a warm blanket and pointed to a space near the fire. The gesture was not one of forgiveness, but of practicality. The children were the priority. The cave was organized into a functioning shelter. The sisters directed the able-bodied men to ferry supplies, wood and food, back to the town for those too old or infirm to make the journey. A system was established. The strong would work, and the vulnerable would be sheltered. The sisters shared their stores without hesitation. Sacks of flour and beans were opened, smoked fish was distributed. They showed the townsfolk how to live frugally, how to make every resource last. They were no longer outcasts, they were leaders, their authority absolute and unquestioned, derived not from any official position but from sheer competence. Days turned into a week, and the week turned into two. The great blizzard was followed by a period of profound, deep cold. The town would have perished. Instead, it survived, huddled around the warmth and foresight of the two young women it had scorned. A new kind of community was forged in the warm, lamplit confines of the cave, one based not on judgment and convention, but on mutual reliance and a shared, humbling experience. Finally, the weather broke. A warm Chinook wind swept down from the mountains, and the great thaw began. The world dripped and melted, and the town of Providence slowly emerged from its white tomb. The people returned to their homes, their lives forever changed. The memory of the cold and the hunger was seared into their collective consciousness, and so was the memory of who had saved them. In the spring, when the first green shoots pushed through the muddy earth, Maeve and Ren stood on the ledge outside their cave, looking down at the valley. The town was stirring back to life. They were no longer orphans, no longer outcasts. They had been offered a place of honor in the town, a home, anything they wanted. They had politely refused, preferring the quiet solitude of their mountain home. They were a part of the community now, but on their own terms. They had not sought recognition or power. They had sought only to survive. In doing so, they had saved everyone else. They watched the smoke rise from the town's chimneys, a sign of life they had helped preserve. They did not smile. They simply stood together, a silent, resilient unit, their gaze fixed on the horizon, ready for the next season, whatever it might bring.